When I heard that The Last of Us was being adapted into a TV series at HBO, I had a lot of doubts. The Last of Us is perhaps one of the greatest games ever, and if you disagree with that, you have to concede that it's one of the most renowned games ever. Renowned for its world, renowned for its moment-to-moment gameplay, and renowned for its incredible story that took players in 2013 on an emotional roller coaster. And I expected that the show would not hold a candle to the game of which it was based off of. This wasn't something that I thought only when it was announced and went away over time either. This was a persistent sentiment that lasted with me and only got more and more strong as time passed by. With casting announcements, set leaks, and even full trailers, I couldn't shake the growing cynical mindset that this show would be one I'd feel nothing but apathy towards as it went on. The show had talent behind it. I knew it would have had decent production value. I wouldn't say I thought it'd be bad exactly, but pointless and confused would probably be the best words to describe what I thought this show was going to be. And this was not without precedent. Adapting a beloved piece of art is a lot harder of an undertaking than people seem to think it is. Theoretically, the hard parts have already been done, making for a much easier time to make the thing transition from its original thing into the thing you're doing. These are really vague terms, I know, but I'm not talking about specifically movies or TV shows here, I'm talking about everything. Book to game, comic to audio drama, whatever pops into your mind. Whilst you have a lot of things figured out before you've even begun production, like characters, story, plot beats, and tone, there's one vital thing that makes adaptation such a laborious undertaking. That being, no matter how you spin it, it's always going to be trying to fit a round shape into a square peg. The challenge will always come down to the struggle of forcing a story to fit into a medium for which it obviously was not intended. Every form of art has its own strengths and weaknesses associated with it. What you can do in a book is not so easily replicated in a movie or TV show and requires a lot of reworking and fine-tuning to strike that delicate balance. And though there are plenty of examples you could all point to as an example of the book was better or the board game was so much cooler, there is no medium that you will see this struggle more in than video games. Games are the newest art form to grace the entertainment industry, whilst things such as movies, shows, and comic books similarly rocked the world and were greeted with skepticism and fear-mongering that it would create the next Ed Gein. They're all something that everyone could pick up and engage with right away. Most people can read, most people can sit down and watch a series of pictures flashing in succession to create a movie, regardless of age, creed, or background. What older people from a generation so different than now cannot do, however, is be sat down, handed a controller, and told to play a video game for upwards of 20 to 50 hours to truly explore some of the best of this new medium. It's obviously a massive generalization to be sure, and yes, random commenter, I have no doubt your grandma can play a Skyrim, but that's not what I'm getting at. What I'm trying to say is that games are a complicated platform for art that contains so much more complexity in adapting into another format than it would be if you were putting text on a book into words on a screenplay. Games are interactive. By asking someone to engage with a game, you're not asking that they take 2 hours out of their day to watch a movie, or sit down and watch a show at their own pace stretched out over days, weeks, or months. For a lot of these games, what you're asking is for people to sit down, learn the mechanics and intricacies of something they've never used before, and get past hours of content all for the sake of getting an experience they may not have had interest in prior. As a result, you get the incredibly uncatchy and clunky term of icky, pissy, putrid spew from the most foul and disease-ridden cesspool of the Hollywood machine. Assassin's Creed, Super Mario Bros, Doom, Doom Annihilation, Tomb Raider, the other Tomb Raider, and take your pick out of these Resident Evil ones, cause there's a lot. All of them bad, boring, and baffling. Baffling that they exist, and baffling that they did so in the way that they did. Leading people who are familiar with the source material to wonder where they went wrong, and leading the general public to forget these movies pretty much as soon as they finish watching it.
What is this shit?
For a variety of reasons, Hollywood studios that eat up these IPs like a money-hungry Pac-Man run into the same brick wall in adapting video game properties. If you want an example of this from recently, I call to the stand Exhibit A. A show that had everything going for it. Based off a well-established IP with a rich world spanning several games, books, animated shorts, and other external media. If done correctly on the big or small screen, Halo could have reached a much wider audience and showcased all the strengths of their universe appealing to a wide group of people. But whether it be in the interest of money or some misplaced notion of creative expression, instead what we got was a bland, formulaic sci-fi series that used some of the least compelling elements of its source material to service some mediocre narrative, all the while forgetting or ignoring what made Halo stand out to so many people. That's the Videogame Adaptation Curse, a fundamental misunderstanding of its source material by those in charge of transitioning it to other mediums, and it's a cycle that keeps repeating without any respite. They're always going to be bad. Uncharted came out recently and look, it's so bad. It's a curse, a hex, an ancient pestilence that will be passed down from one to the next. It cannot change its fundamental nature. Or can it? This curse is one that is subject to semantics and technicalities when you really break it down. Recently, there's been quite a renaissance of video game adjacent media getting pretty good to amazing critical reception. Cyberpunk Edgerunners, for example, is one of the only animes I've seen and is directly inspired by one of the most controversial games of all time, and that show is amazing. Taking some of the best elements from the game and remixing it into a compelling story that will stick with me for years. There are other ones too, but Edgerunners is the only big one I've actually sat down and watched. I've never played or seen The Witcher, and I'd rather get clubbed in the head by a 5-iron than touch League of Legends. Though The Witcher receives some good critical reception from fans of the games, and for what I hear, Arcane is very well written and loved. However, all of these struggle to be called adaptations, per se. Cyberpunk Edgerunners was developed alongside the game and takes place in the same universe, and Cyberpunk 2077 itself is based off an already existing tabletop RPG of the same name, so calling it an adaptation is more kind of misleading. Similarly, The Witcher, while taking direct cues from the games, is based off Polish mythology and a series of novels. And I haven't watched Arcane or have any understanding of its universe, but I can't seem to get a concrete answer of whether or not the show is a straight adaptation or just a story in the universe like Edgerunners. Other more successful video game movies and shows have very loose source material. Sonic the Hedgehog fans may disagree, but those games from a glance don't seem to have much to adapt aside from an annoying blue hedgehog and his weird looking friends. And Angry Birds can pretty much be whatever the writer and director wants, as long as there's a slingshot, some Angry Birds, and Terrence. Out of all these projects to come out recently though, The Last of Us was unique, as unlike the rest of these it was going to be a straight adaptation. It wasn't a story told in the same world as the games, it wasn't taking influence and remixing parts of Neil Druckmann and Bruce Straley's story, and it wasn't a vague IP that you could really do anything with. No. The Last of Us was more than just a game you can turn your brain off and mindlessly play for a couple of hours. It was an experience, a game changer, a story that while cliche meant a lot to a lot of people and stood out as one of the best in its genre. It's easy to, from a first glance, write the game off as yet another zombie game about mowing down hordes of infected, but very quickly you realize there's so much more to it than what meets the eye. It was a story about a broken, hollow man who lost a vital part of himself, and throughout the course of the story, he repairs what was lost and holds on tightly to his last remaining vestige of humanity. For all the violence and the death and the broken bottles, bricks and molotovs, what you had was a story about love between a father and a daughter and what kind of people love drives them to be. When making a TV show adapting one of the best video game stories of all time, it's important you don't fuck it up and live up to the legacy of what came before. And did the show do this? And did it do it well?
Okay.
To my surprise, The Last of Us on HBO not only exceeded my expectations but completely flipped them on its head. The show was more than just a repeat of the story we all know and love, albeit with a fresh coat of live action paint. It did what all good adaptations do, it changed the source material and retooled it to fit within a new medium without being unfaithful to the original vision. And while it's easy to sit here and gush endlessly about what this show did so well, that's not what this video is and not what it's going to be. Because while this show does a lot of good, it also does a lot of stuff I don't really vibe with. Were some of these changes necessary? Were some of its decisions to do with casting and execution misplaced? And did this show even need to exist in the first place? So while I could wax all poetic about the good, the bad, and the clickers, I want to take a much more measured and analytical approach in the why this show chose to veer at points and why it chose to stay faithful at others. Dissect what makes this better than all the other movies and shows made in the last few decades and why this one stands out as the black sheep amongst stuff like Halo. And there's plenty of reasons to get into, but as with all things, it stems back to the people that made it. The biggest credit of Last of Us co-creator Craig Mazin was Chernobyl, a short 5-episode HBO miniseries following the horrific events of the Pripyat disaster in 1986, taking an overlooked but horrifying event in recent history and spinning it into a series about humanity's insistence to avoid personal responsibility. Watching the show feels like you're watching a horror movie with a fixed focus on the people at the ground level, fighting desperately against an invisible threat that was always present and was always preventable. The dread and existentialism of Chernobyl resonated with millions around the world, and for a while they touted it as one of the best and most gripping dramas of recent years. HBO, being proud of fostering another success for the network, offered Mazin another crack at producing a new series to irradiate the popular zeitgeist with renown, acclaim, and a story that will stick with them for years to come. For Craig Mazin, the next project of interest for him is blindingly obvious if you've been paying attention. The Last of Us. It was The Last of Us. Craig played through it several times and like me and you fell in love with its story, characters, and world. We've gone through what The Last of Us is and how beloved it is, but I think it's understated just how influential this game really was and why more than any other game out there at the time, this was one Mason felt like everyone had to experience. Before The Last of Us, stories of games were absolutely an afterthought made to complement the gameplay. This isn't me saying there was no well-written video games before The Last of Us though, because there were, and we'll get back to talking about it later. But they weren't done in the same way as The Last of Us. For Neil Druckmann, he wanted to create a game that was different from other stuff developer Naughty Dog had done with their previous games, centered the story around a theme, characters, and the kind of things most games strayed away from. Ludonarrative dissonance is the word of the day. The go-to example is always Naughty Dog's previous series, Uncharted, where good guy adventurer Nathan Drake is a swashbuckling Indiana Jones during cutscenes and a remorseless mass murder in gameplay segments without it once being addressed. The Last of Us was built around doing the opposite, following a character that had become numb to the ruthless world he lives in, as well as the countless lives he's had to take, innocent, guilty, whatever. He's a bad guy who does bad guy things, and you get to play that kind of character in a world so different from Uncharted. It's violent and gross and scary, but it's also kind of beautiful, and it was all built to service that character in a theme you'd find nowhere else in any other video game. And against all assumptions, that theme wasn't something the stereotypical zombie thing would adopt. This wasn't no Walking Dead, it wasn't just about survival or any other boring thing like that. This game was about love.
We wanted to make an experience that really explored the unconditional love a parent feels for a child. How can we construct a story that through its interaction, through its characters, through the relationship, through music, through everything we have at our disposal, make you feel the wonderful and horrible things that can come out of love.
In a lot of ways, The Last of Us was the perfect game to adapt into a TV show of any. It's not that hard to translate a lot of these iconic scenes to something like film and television, in part because The Last of Us was already so influenced by that in its storytelling and visuals to begin with. Children of Men, 28 Days Later, and The Road were all very noticeable influences on The Last of Us's design and story, and it wears those inspirations on its sleeve. Which is kind of why I have the skepticism and doubt of the show in the first place. I said at the beginning of this video I felt as the show progressed I'd feel nothing but apathy. And this wasn't because I thought it'd be of poor quality, I thought it'd just be fine and do what was expected of it. Recreate the game, beat for beat, and play it super safe, which you ask me is not that interesting and doesn't validate why this needed to happen. Going into the pilot, I was expecting a by-the-numbers repetition of the first few minutes of the game. Start with Sarah giving Joel his iconic birthday watch. Wake up, see an explosion from the distance. Watch the beginning of the outbreak. Jimmy, I'm warning you. Cool road trip with Uncle Tommy. Seeing the sights. Boom! Run, run, run. Meet a soldier on the road and watch Sarah's life drain from her eyes.
Sarah just bit the big one.
With that first episode, my expectations were taken to the back of a movie theater and beaten relentlessly, as the opening didn't start with Joel waking up, or Sarah waking up, or the world waking up to see explosions, Jimmy, and car crashes. Instead, we get this foreboding talk show segment set years before the outbreak, to explain the whole nature of the cordyceps fungus, its rules, how it spreads, and what would happen if that kind of virus made the leap from bugs to humans. Watching this introduction sent a pretty clear message that this show would not be adaptation without innovation.
Is everyone raving about The Last of Us show because it's just a one-to-one retelling of the game?
No, shut the fuck up. The reason why this intro works so well is that it sends a message on two levels. For one, if you're familiar with the game, great. Here's what you know presented in a different way with ultimately the same endpoint, which for better or worse is what the show as a whole is. And if you're a newcomer coming into the show with no context, like say my parents who watched the show completely detached from the knowledge it was based off an acclaimed video game, then welcome, the barrier to entry is not that high. The show appeals to both camps in ways that I feel innovate on the original game whilst remaining loyal to its intent. Going into the show, it was clear that Mason, and to a lesser extent Neil Druckmann, were aware that with each medium accommodations were necessary. For the game, jumping right into Sarah's shoes on the night of the outbreak and watching the world fall apart around her is great for immersion and putting the player in the same situation as her. But it's also good because it's short. All in all, pre-outbreak dead little corpse girl that went to hell gameplay lasts only about 15 minutes, then we're right into Children of Men, because it's a game and people just want to get on with the gameplay. But in a show, you don't have to do that. You can build on that sense of foreboding chaos from the game and stretch it out to a longer space of time and fill it with more information that will be relevant later. That talk show segment is a stroke of genius for making the Sarah section that much more tense. We know as an audience that something is coming and we have information these characters don't, so we're waiting for that inevitable moment that the dam will start to break. And amidst that bomb under the table tension, we get some character stuff that was nowhere to be found in the game but enriches it. We get to see more of the Joel and Sarah relationship, Tommy being a part of the military, character moments for Joel, more stuff to do with the actual outbreak itself, where it comes from, how it was spread, and how that affected people and the world around them. We get none of that in the game, and it works. But when retelling the story, what good is it to just walk familiar ground without once changing direction? This pilot is a microcosm of several other things to do with the show. The first episode does a great job at highlighting what the rest of the series is going to be, the decisions it makes with how to execute the story echo throughout the whole show. It's like a cordyceps fungus burrowing into an ant's brain and sprouting off into branches, spreading its spores over the rest of the show and infecting it with its influence. It's fresh, it's new, but it's familiar and honest, which speaks to the collaboration in Neil Druckmann and Craig Mazin. Neil, as the game's original architect, is there to be the guy who keeps it level, the guy who makes sure that every part of the show is loyal to that original premise that made the game stand out. Not the clickers, not the world, but that theme of love conquers all not necessarily being a good thing. And Craig is there to be the one that adds all that fresh newness I was talking about earlier. Remember that talk show segment I talked about earlier? That wasn't the brainchild of Neil Druckmann, it's the idea Craig Mazin introduced the unfamiliar audience to the whole thing that starts the story. Which you kinda need to know. It's a real world thing, but most people don't know what a cordyceps is, and it's a pill you have to make very easy to swallow for newcomers to the series. Neil Druckmann's idea was to just use the David Attenborough documentary on the fungus as a quick way to say, this is what this is what we're doing. Which, if you ask me, is really boring and doesn't have the style or pizzazz that will make it stick into an audience's mind. What made Chernobyl so terrifying wasn't that the thing happened in real life. The information is interesting or scary, but doesn't stick out in anyone's brain. It was that the writing was on the wall to begin with, and nobody at the ground level did anything to prevent it. It mirrors our real world as well, especially now where we've all gone through a global pandemic that was handled poorly by the powers that be. It attacks a collective fear of hubris not tackling a problem before it's too late. And that's what this intro does. We get everything we need to know in a way that doesn't take you out of the experience the same way a clip from a real world documentary would. This is natural, this is creepy, and this sticks in people's minds. I think the difference between the two voices and why it's such a good combo is because they come from two vastly different worlds. Neil Druckmann is a game guy that deals with code, RAM, DualShock guitar gameplay, and texture glitches. Video game stuff. The Last of Us took influence from film and TV, but it was designed and created as a game that uses conventions of that art form. Craig Mazin, on the other hand, is from the world of lights, camera, action, showbiz, boom mic, stunt doubles, and medium shots. Which, despite what your average pretentious, I hate movie games gamer will tell you, is something wholly distinct from a Last of Us or a God of War. TV and film is a linear medium. The audience has no input on what they watch. They can't change anything, and they can't walk around the set and see sus secret rooms. All they can see is what's presented right in front of them, but in video games, the world is your oyster. In The Last of Us, while the game is pretty linear, you can walk around and optionally look at a ton of little notes and areas that tell a whole story unto themselves or contribute to the main one. Walk around the Boston QZ and you can see Fedra executing infected civilians, wanted posters for fireflies like Marlene before you meet her, black market stores exchanging shoes for ration cards, draft notices, you get the idea. The big riddle for Craig Mazin to solve is trying to deliver that information in a way that flows into the scene and show instead of grinding it to a halt like using a Planet Earth documentary would. It's important information for world building, you gotta implement it somehow. So you rewrite scenes to include the information naturally for a TV watching audience. With Fedra, you need to know what their ideology is, what kind of world they operate, and how they maintain their power as a faction. In the game, so you know how ruthless they are, they show a raid on an apartment building in the Boston QZ to check for any infected. They scan for each one before eventually finding somebody who tests positive.
No. I'm not infected.
Hold
It's
her
wrong.
down.
The scan's wrong.
Do it.
Please.
It's small, but it's effective. It gets across the key information quickly and in a way that doesn't grind the game to a halt, but it wouldn't work in a TV setting. For one, the interaction is completely an optional one. It's there as a blink and you'll miss it point of environmental storytelling, and putting it into the show one-to-one with the game would be distracting. In-game, the decision to watch is due to you, the player, taking an interest. In-universe, Joel probably wouldn't care to stick around and watch. The guy is numb to the violent world he lives in, has an attitude of, people die, best not to dwell. Him staying there to watch would be a distracting point of inconsistent character writing and just wouldn't make sense with what we know about the guy. In the show, we get that information in the form of an infected kid stumbling across the QZ with Fedra taking him in for screening.
What if I told you that after we gave you some medicine, we're gonna find you your favorite food to eat? It's just a little needle. It's okay. You're safe.
With this, you understand everything about how Fedra operates as a faction. You can see how committed they are to ensuring the QZ remains quarantined, the gravity of being infected, what that means for you, and how being bit in everyone's eyes is a death sentence. But there's also an element of humanity. These Fedra soldiers have been humanized. They're not just copy-pasted NPCs wearing helmets you gun down without mercy. There's an implication that these are just normal guys, likely drafted into what in their minds is a necessary situation. It's very Children of Men. It's a fact of life that shit like this happens, but that doesn't mean they're happy about it. And then that leads into the introduction of post-outbreak Joel. He tosses the corpse of that kid under the fire with no emotion. One out of many lost souls who came to the QZ seeking sanctuary and ended up dead, because that's the state the world world is in. It took several elements from the game, communicated through gameplay, and repackaged it into a few scenes that show the same information in a way which is seamless and immersive with everything we've seen before. And that's the main struggle that comes with adapting video games, even one like The Last of Us. A lot of you may have heard me talking about The Last of Us being a pioneer of storytelling in video games and scoffed at the implication it was the first instance of amazing storytelling in video games. And if that was your takeaway, then I agree too. Examples off the top of my head of games that feature amazing narratives prior to The Last of Us are BioShock, Fallout New Vegas, and Spec Ops: The Line. But with each of these, there's a caveat. I said that a lot of games were conceived with gameplay first, story second. The priority for these devs first and foremost was to make a game people would want to play with a narrative built around the mechanics. The story is a background element, in most cases it's icing, something that is secondary to the cool gameplay mechanics. While me and perhaps you consider story a priority in a lot of games, the overwhelming majority are thinking, well, this is cool and all, but I want to chop people's heads off, I want to kill, die, die, die. And the developers know you're a little monster. They know your average guy who comes home from work isn't playing BioShock to contemplate morality or socioeconomics. What they want to do is shoot things with a Tommy gun. So what do games do when they want to tell a story and know most players won't care?
You promised me release, Typoh.
We're not gonna send anybody to die.
As much as I love games like BioShock, if you play the game purely through what the game presents linearly, then it's just noise. When you really dive deep down into all the little details and notes found in the game, what you get is an extremely nuanced and intricate story about a variety of topics. The nature of video game narratives, the laissez-faire ideology of objectivism, and the nature of any society built around such an ideology. Playing the game and listening to the notes, I was completely enraptured by its backstory. The war between Andrew Ryan and Frank Fontaine, the questions it asked about how far science and technology should be pursued in the name of progress. But that amazing story and incredible narrative has been kept mostly confined to those audio logs and instances of amazing environmental storytelling. You have to be actively looking for the story in order to get the full picture and understand basic things like, who is Frank Fontaine? How did your character come to be? What's the deal with the little sisters and big daddies? What is their purpose? Fallout New Vegas has a rich world of a story you can really sink your teeth into, but in order to find that big, meaty, oily story, you gotta filter through hundreds of in-game notes, audio diaries, interact with dozens of NPCs, and look into the ideology of each faction to truly understand all of the moving parts. They're not approachable to someone who doesn't know video games. It's a completely different language. Spec Ops: The Line is a game that can be great taken as its own individual story, but so much of it is built around being a critique of military shooters like Call of Duty. It's using the language of video games to tell a story that wouldn't function in any other medium, which is great, I love it. But all three of these have one thing in common, and that's that their stories are ones that wouldn't be understandable or approachable to someone who doesn't know the art form of video games. And unlike a BioShock or a Spec Ops: The Line where gameplay was the spine and the story was the nervous system, The Last of Us' story was the focus before the gameplay. Its inception started with Neil Druckmann wanting to make a game based around what Uncharted avoided. What kind of man kills without question, and why does he do that? Who does he do it for? And the gameplay was built to service that foundation. You'd have to actively be trying to avoid the story to not understand it, and that was why it was so revolutionary. For its opening, it broke that barrier to entry that existed for people unfamiliar with the medium. It's universal, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have gameplay or audio logs or notes or environmental storytelling that are vital to understanding some of the greater intricacies of the story. The Boston QZ as a location is informed by what you learn through gameplay, with all that video game stuff spread across the section, as well as how the loop of kill, gather, reload, kill establishes and builds the world. You are Joel. It's not hard to attach yourself to him because he is you. He is Typoh. Typoh is Joel. The two are bonded, it's symbiotic, but in TV that bond is severed. Instead of having the freedom to move around and explore the scenery, or have story beats and themes contextualized through picking up a controller and playing, you have to observe everything in a linear format where what you see is what you get. On paper, most of it should be pretty seamless, going from game to screen, but for Mazin and Druckmann, they realized that going one for one wasn't necessarily going to work as well or be as impactful as they were in its namesake, which mostly had to do with the difference of storytelling between both mediums. Games tend to be fixed on the character that you play, with two exceptions. The first game hinges its perspective entirely on Joel and never breaks on that. For the show, however, Craig and Neil wanted to take advantage of making something for television and give us a viewport into the minds of multiple characters, like the talk show but extended across several other moments. The beginnings of the outbreak in Jakarta, Fedra, Bill and Frank, the hunters, etc. And for some of these, pretty major changes had to be made in taking them from characters you interact with in game, and that's it, to ones you get to properly see more in their element. In the game, there are two tourists in the Pittsburgh QZ, a determined, competent survivor and a naive kid placed in the older's care. Wolf and Cub, big brother, little brother, made to mirror the dynamic between Joel and Ellie and further expand the theme that love is not always the great big happy ball of niceness most would think it is. Henry is super protective over Sam, like Joel, and has invested most of his purpose to protecting his one person. Then things change. Sam gets bit, Henry has to put him down, and then himself after losing that one thing he swore to protect no matter what. How do you keep living when someone you love is gone? That's Joel's conflict, and that's what Henry and Sam remind him he could be like again if he gets too close to Ellie. It's great, it works amazing, and you wouldn't think it would take much deviation to translate, but when making the show, Craig quickly realised that the duo was too similar to Joel and Ellie to a fault. If the show was going to spend a few minutes with the duo on their own, detached from the main story, it would get really old, really quick, and the two had the same dynamic and type of conversations as Joel and Ellie. So the creators switched things up. They cut out Sam's eardrums, made him younger with a cheeky bit of cancer thrown in for good measure, and turned Henry from a competent survivor in this world equal to Joel in most situations, into someone who's never killed anyone before. A guy who ratted out his own neighbours and friends in order to save his little brother, and this small change sends shockwaves throughout the rest of this little Pittsburgh diversion. Don't get me wrong, I have a few issues with what these episodes could have been, what it could have introduced, but judging it based off what it did instead of what it could have been, I really like all this. Sam being younger makes his relationship with Ellie a lot different. Instead of being more or less an equal to Ellie, Sam is now kind of a little brother to Ellie herself. Sam's death in the game was definitely impactful, but it adds a whole new layer of heartbreak with the show's added context. Sam being innocent makes the death more sad. Ellie trying or thinking she could cure him with her blood also makes his death more sad. And that reveal in the game comes nowhere close to matching the emotion of the shows. And I love that we see Ellie's reaction to all this instead of Joel's. It's as much a lesson for her as it is for him. Joel learns more or less the same lesson as he did in the game. But now Ellie comes away with more of a motivation to help the Fireflies create a vaccine, and it also plants in the audience's mind that maybe the validity of this cure is pretty in doubt. And this all came about due to using the strengths of television instead of falling back onto what the game did. If you were to ask me the question of, what's better, this show or the game, I would hands down say, the game. Just because this little deaf kid died in a sadder way doesn't mean I like the overall package as much. But there are things that are much stronger. Case in point, little deaf kid and his wimpy older brother. Compared to the game, there's so much more there and a lot more to sink your teeth into. Same goes for David and his group, Jackson, and any added context to this world is a real treat. But notice with all these examples, they come from parts of the game that were secondary. People that you didn't step into the shoes of and shoot zombies in the face as. The Last of Us' success didn't come down to its aesthetic or presenting a entire genre in a new way. Those things certainly helped, but in the end it came down to the two main characters you view those things as. They're the core of the story, and if you mess up those characters, then the story as a whole suffers. Going into the show, this was the major thing I had to adapt to. I didn't like the casting when it was announced, and that goes both ways. Pedro Pascal to me seemed a decision motivated by him playing damn near the same kind of character in The Mandalorian. Hardened mercenary with a backstory that makes him want to protect a kid in a broken world who has to kill members of an extreme faction so he can get said kid back. But based off what I had seen from him at that point, I didn't have a lot of confidence he would be able to embody Joel from the games. He isn't just a blank sheet of paper with the words gruff, hardened, numb, and dad written on it. Joel's a lot more than his blurb would give him credit for and requires a lot of subtle range to pull off convincingly. For the most part, he's pretty calm and collected in the opening portions of the game. He doesn't freak the fuck out or drown his sorrows in whiskey, he's just kinda there. A numb vessel that goes about the motions until we see the layers get peeled back over time. He isn't Wolverine, so angry and broken he goes around the woods killing people like some kind of bear man. He's a person. And I didn't have a great deal of confidence the monotone Mando would be able to do that. Bit mean? Maybe. Bit close-minded? Absolutely. But no matter what, seeing anyone but Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson embody these roles was going to be a hard adjustment. And as much as I'd like to say for both of these that they surprised me right out the gate and I love their performances during the whole series, that would be a lie. It's like my YouTube analytics now, up and down and up, all over the place. Pedro Pascal managed to win me over at the opening and how he sells the emotions of a father losing his daughter, and Bella Ramsey I did not like at all in the first episode. As much as people tout this show as loyal and faithful, I found that with the two of them I kinda had to emotionally divorce myself from the game and accept that these were two completely different people and view their performances in a vacuum. Like I said, Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson were always at the back of my mind, reminding me what they did with these two that worked so well and forcing me to compare and contrast with what Bella Ramsey Quality and Pedro Pascal were doing. When talking about adaptations throughout this video, it's mostly been in regards to books being adapted into film and television. And while I don't want to devalue the struggle of making something not intended to be visual, it's definitely a lot easier to do and comes with much less challenges. With a book, all you have to work off of is the words on the page and the description of the author, which for the process of filmmaking allows for the people making these to have complete real estate when you're thinking about how should this be shot, what should the score sound like, how does this world look like, who best captures the vibes of these characters. Compare and contrast the Rankin Bass Lord of the Rings with the Peter Jackson one, both working off the same source material but with much different presentation, and that's because they didn't have a reference for this stuff other than a written description. The problem when adapting a video game is that it's already visual and allows for much less of that experimentation. Craig Mazin and Neil Druckmann weren't thinking about how the clickers should look like or what the music would sound like, because they already have these things. Hell, one of them was in the room pitching ideas for how everything should be shot 10 fucking years ago. It already has scenes, a soundtrack, and actors delivering the lines that Neil Druckmann wrote while he was drinking his chai tea or whatever he drinks. Probably whiskey in all honesty. Last of Us 2 release day must have been fucking rough for the guy. Ashley Johnson and Troy Baker weren't just voice actors. Their performance was motion captured. Many of the little emotions and subtle eccentricities of the two were derived from them playing around with the material and shaping Joel and Ellie as the game was made. Both to this day still stand as some of the best performances in a video game. For the show, Craig and Neil tried to bring back as much of the old guard as they possibly could. The old composer came back, bits of concept art were repurposed, and some of these shots are completely one-for-one with the game, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It sounds lame and really pretentious to say, but if the look is the body and the writing is the brain, then the acting is the soul, man. It's the butter on the bread, man. It's the yum goodness that keeps you invested, man. Unlike music, dialogue, and cinematography, acting is the one thing that can't be preserved. And to be honest, I find it probably the hardest thing to do with this show to talk about. Where in other areas I've praised the show's ability to change and subvert the game in ways I feel improve upon the material, this is an area I find myself struggling to say whether I wholly like or dislike. It's my YouTube analytics, down and up, gains and losses. It's not just to do with the acting, which I had to divorce myself from, it's also the fact that this version of the characters are almost completely distinct from the game in admittedly minor ways. For starters, Joel. In the show, it feels like Craig and Neil wanted to go more out of their way to make Joel a bit softer. Not a great deal, mind you, he still kills and tortures. On the surface, these are the same guy. Tough mercenary, numb to the world but with a vestige of humanity remaining. Someone with experience and an underlying anger and violence. But not as much. Maybe you could argue this was to better translate to TV. My parents watched and liked this show, and I've been wondering whether or not they would have liked it as much if Joel was accurate to his in-game counterpart. We've done this song and dance before. Joel was the anti-Nathan Drake. He didn't hesitate, he didn't waver. If game Joel found someone with a sniper rifle in a middle-class home, he wouldn't have had a little cry, he'd have killed that sniper. Game Joel is unwavering in his principles. Throughout the game you can find little sites showing the worst of this world, which Ellie questions, executed Fedra soldiers, baby graves, and piles of bodies burning away. And for all these interactions, Joel has basically the same response.
What if they had families?
Everyone has a family. Best not to dwell on it.
Joel has skeletons in his closet, but unlike a rich businessman in the American South, he doesn't exactly hide them. In the past, him and Tommy were hunters, no different to those you're killing in Pittsburgh. They tricked and killed innocent people, all in the name of survival. Game Joel doesn't dwell on this, viewing it as necessary for making it through each day, and that's all that time was to him.
For all those goddamn years I took care of us.
And though I would disagree, there's maybe an argument that people watching that character in the show would be hard to root for. You're not playing as this Joel, you're watching him. You're not forced into the same situation as him through gameplay, you're an outsider looking in. He's not numb to these violent acts, he's ashamed of them.
Did you kill innocent people?
Show Joel is more vulnerable. It's not necessarily a bad thing that a lot less has been left to the imagination. It gives Pedro Pascal an opportunity to have more range and be more emotional.
It's all I do. It's all I've ever done. It's failure.
The constant deaths in this get to him, and the fear that Ellie would be another name to add to the list is a source for a lot of conflict. This Joel is someone who's routinely failed all the people he cared about. Sarah died, Tommy left, Tess died, Bill and Frank died, and now he's saddled with this girl who could very well end up like them. Which is an interesting way to reinterpret this character, and I think Pedro Pascal does it well. The issue is we get two Joels in one. I don't find it particularly hard to distance myself from the source material when I'm not constantly reminded of it, but when I am,
You've just come after her.
I hate it. I like this show best when it disregards its source and does its own thing. A more vulnerable Joel I can get behind, but it's harder for me to buy into scenes that are one for one with the game when it's so clearly not who I'm watching, both in terms of the actor playing him and the character I'm seeing. It's an immediate disconnect when this show goes one for one. It's really hard to watch and shows all my problems with Pedro's performance. In scenes unique to the show, Joel is much more open and emotional, but as soon as we get to something from the game, he immediately closes shop. And it comes off so bizarre to me. Same goes for Bella Ramsey. Unlike Pedro Pascal, whose performance I found myself liking less and less as the show went on, Bella's became one I grew on a lot more. She maintained a lot of that original charm that made Ellie so likable and added in her own nuances that I feel made her better in certain scenes from Ashley Johnson.
Tell them that Ellie is a little girl who broke her fucking finger!
But there was still that inescapable audible little DID demon reminding me just how much better some of these scenes were with Ashley Johnson and Troy Baker. The argument between Joel and Ellie in the house, like a lot of other scenes listed from the game, falls flat on its face, lacking anywhere close to the emotion and depth we see in the game.
No. Don't say another word.
Ellie? You are treading on some mighty thin ice here.
It's difficult to talk about stuff relating to acting without constantly playing a game of comparison. Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson are these characters. They're a fundamental part of their identity you can't separate. The roles were written around them. So many impactful story moments of the game were due to their input as actors. So inherently, when making the game into a show, you're working with several handicaps. Going into production, Pedro and Bella were instructed to avoid looking at the game so that they could develop the characters as actors instead of trying to impersonate what's already been done. Which is good. It allows them to develop the characters themselves without trying to ape what came before, but that's undermined by scenes where the show is trying to ape what came before. There's a disconnect. Show Joel and Show Ellie have a lot of traits in common with the Pixel versions, but they are different interpretations. Joel is more soft and emotional, Ellie is more brash and openly ready for violence. This Ellie isn't freaking out over seeing gnomes or marveling at abandoned music stores. This Ellie has got a bloodlust. Looking like a goblin who saw gold, watching Joel brutally beat a man to death, and treating it like Christmas when she finds a new gun to shoot people with. I'm fine with that. I can divorce myself from it, but I can't do that when we get old shit thrown back at us. Another issue to do with the two is time. I've said it just like so much, but video games aren't often a straight line. Even in more linear games like The Last of Us, you're encouraged to veer off the path, discover things about the world, and in so doing you gain a greater understanding of Joel and Ellie. The game has a lot of downtime in between combat encounters, and it takes those opportunities to let you get to know these two better. Ellie will talk about things throughout the world, Joel will give his commentary upon finding random notes and scenery, and every so often Ellie will whip out her little joke book to lighten the mood. It's a journey, it feels like one, trekking through all the states with horrors and downtime in between. But with the show, it's limited by being on that TV linear path. It's only 9 episodes long, and by trimming the fat, I feel like they've cut out a vital part of what makes The Last of Us, The Last of Us. Whilst by all accounts it's an easier game to adapt into a show than most others, its video game roots are so entrenched into the very nature of its story that something is lost in getting rid of that video game element. There's a reason why so many potential adaptations stumble and die before they can walk. They're unfilmable. So, we gotta talk about gameplay and violence. Watchmen was a graphic novel written by Alan Moore in 1986. The comic was seen as a game changer for the industry, breaking records and receiving plenty of renown that helped legitimize comics as an expression of literature with writing on the same level of many of the most revered novels. Cut to a few decades later, and big film guy who done did that one movie with the Spartans decided he wanted to give Watchmen a crack in 2009, taking direct cues from the comic, using it as a storyboard for some scenes to try and make everything as accurate as possible. The issue with the film and the issue the comic's creator Alan Moore has is that it's taken a round shape and trying to force it into a square peg. The comic book wasn't a simple story that could be plot from one medium to another, it was a showcase of everything graphic novels could do, taking advantage of its sequential framing, using the back end of each issue as an opportunity to flesh out the world, and having characters' manner of speech and personality be illustrated through its speech bubbles. Film storyboards are not the same thing as panels from a comic, it isn't a seamless transition. Many themes, moments, and characters were butchered in this transition. If there's any comparison to Watchmen in the video game industry, and if Bioshock is excluded, then The Last of Us is the best point of comparison. A pioneer of the medium that received renown from countless critics and created a movement of other games trying to ape its success. Big difference is when it came to the adaptation, its showrunners actually took into account what changes would have to be made going from one medium to another. We've gone through a lot of those, but probably its most controversial change was its depiction of violence. Before the show even came out, the general public knew very little about the divergences that the show would make. We knew that the outbreak would start in 2003 instead of 2013, we knew spores would not be a part of the world anymore, and that the dead gay guy in the Hawaiian shirt would now be an actual character instead of a lifeless corpse you couldn't even shoot. But the big thing that shook a lot of people on the internet was Craig Mazin talking about how the show would depict violence, or rather how it would not depict it. In an interview, he said that,
"When you're playing a section, you're killing people, and when you die, you get sent back to the checkpoint. All those people are back, moving around in the same way. Watching a person die, I think, ought to be much different than watching pixels die."
For a lot of people, this was a sign that Mazin had no idea what he was talking about, and was yet another old head writer scoffing at video games, disregarding them as a platform for senseless violence with no meaning. Which, no, that's not what he's saying. What he's trying to say is that while violence in games can have impact and effect, for the most part it's usually there functionally as a sort of puzzle to solve. You gotta wipe everyone off the board to progress, and when you're playing a game like The Last of Us, any weight you could get from looking the man in the eyes and bashing his head in with some kind of weapon or implement is gone, when you die to the same enemy over and over and over again. They're an obstacle, they're pixels that are in your way, and it's exceptionally hard to see them as anything other than that. Perfect example of this is ironically The Last of Us Part 2. That game wants so badly for you to think about the morality of your actions, to question the cycle of violence and whether or not revenge will give you solace. It wants you to feel bad about murdering these people, but the thing is, I don't care about any of these guys, and why should I? I don't care if the same character models have names, or if the dogs cry when you kill their owner. The gameplay is fun. Killing things is fun. Die, die, die. I can explode them, stab them, roast them, and all sorts. They're pixels, I don't care, and it's not like I have any say whether or not shooting a guy in the head with an exploding arrow is okay. I literally cannot progress if I don't kill them, and they don't give me any other option. And yeah, if the show had an action scene every episode, it would just be pointless noise that would get really old and, dare I say, boring. Violent gunplay is something intrinsic to the type of game The Last of Us is. They exist to have your brain flood with excitement and tension, not often contextualized in anything to do with the story. Oops, stop the heartfelt argument, we gotta fight raiders. You need that serotonin boost when you cut through enemies with a machete. It's part of the contract you signed when you bought the game. But when you're given the task of bringing that game into television, the first things that should go on the cutting room floor are probably those video gamey combat encounters. Because story-wise, having Fedra swoop in, ambush Joel and Ellie at the Capitol building doesn't really contribute anything to the story or tell you anything about the world other than giving you a thing to shoot. Same goes for shooting raiders in the ranch house, the Left 4 Dead sequence in the winter segment. It's there so your average gamer has something to stay invested in other than story. The Last of Us was never really a game built about killing zombies or a game about escaping from bandits. It was very character focused and purposeful exploration of a theme, and that's what needs to be translated. Give me the choice between heartfelt character moments and scenes where you get to explore the main duo's dynamic, motivations and relationships, or a non-stop action roller coaster where Joel gets 2 revolvers and goes absolutely insane. I choose the former. Watching the show week by week, I was able to enjoy it for what it was and what it was presenting, but when it came to the finale, a lot of the last 8 episodes soured in retrospect. Episode 9 is probably the second worst episode in the entire season for me, beat out only by that Left Behind one. And that's because it is the most one-to-one repetition of the game, but with many of its most crucial components that make these moments so impactful missing. And I'm not talking about Pedro's plank of wood acting or not having a scene where you torch Jerry the Doctor with a flamethrower. I'm talking about how the payoff of this long journey falls short due to inadequate build-up. It's always this line I go back to, this moment when the cracks start to show.
How long till she's torn apart by infected or murdered by raiders? Because she lives in a broken world that you could have saved.
If you played the game, this is a part that's immediately recognizable. Marlene says it there as well, and it's a real moment for me that makes you debate and wonder about whether or not Joel is in the right. Because speaking within the context of the game, she is right. Joel and Ellie have been on this crazy cross-country epic where they almost die several times and see some of the worst of this world. Fallen QZ is turned into raider groups, dead fireflies everywhere, and encounters that tell you this world is well and truly fucked. Whether Joel killing the fireflies is good or not is irrelevant. This is a broken world with very little stability and reprieve, and what guarantee is there that he can protect Ellie? Hell, she almost dies under Joel's watch just before being taken by the fireflies. For the show, I just don't get that vibe, and a lot of that comes down to its decision to axe those video gamey parts of the story. Whilst it's admirable and sensible to keep the story character focused instead of action packed, in so doing you distill the most vital part of the narrative. The game is about love, the show is about love, it's about how while love can be good, it can also be brutal and primal. You're put into a world where every day is life or death, either you get taken by raiders or ripped apart by infected, and that's all communicated through gameplay. It's kill or be killed, there's very little sense to the violence other than that, it's why there's zombies to begin with. With the show, however, this isn't that brutal kill or be killed world. This is different, and I don't think the decision from Mazin to avoid overarching brutality was one necessarily for the best. And no, before anyone says it, I don't believe the show has been completely immune to the violence. It's still there and it is still used to mean something. Ellie kills a guy, Joel feels bad, and it drives their relationship forward. More boring and less in-depth than the game's sniper segment, but whatever, it's functional. Joel gets hurt, Ellie has to fend for herself and shoot a gun or two. Tess gets bit, and in a great change from the game, violence is a point of connection for Joel and Ellie. Sarah sees her dad kill someone and it frightens her. Ellie sees Joel beat a man to death and she leans forward. As a duo, Joel and Ellie are therefore more connected as father and daughter because they both have that violent heart. However, my point is that it's distilled, filtered down, less effective. The infected aren't a constant reminder of anything. Aside from the outbreak scene, episode 2 and 5, they're almost a non-presence. There's no raiders anymore. In their place, we get a newly empowered, organized revolution with a clear vendetta and structure, as well as David's group of what are essentially refugees. Neil Druckmann is obsessed with this idea that everyone is the hero of their own story. To some, Joel and Ellie are the bad guys, and they're the people with a code that don't torch people with a flamethrower. They got burritos, farms, schools, the whole 9 yards. But I think there's just as much a place for a world that's morally fucked, which can be equally compelling. A place where there's no such thing as morals, where people are doing whatever they think is necessary to make it through each day, no matter how messed up it is. I do like what the show did with the Pittsburgh section, changing Henry and Sam to be more emotionally resonant and applying a face and a motivation to a group that was a faceless concept before. I like Kathleen, I understand her, why she does what she does, and the story of this revolution that fell due to revenge is compelling. But what did we lose in getting that story? Pittsburgh in the game was Ellie's first real exposure to this world's reality. Apart from the infected, it's host to a bunch of monsters who do anything just to fuel their own selfish collective. She sees a familiar place that fell and became worse than Fedra of a whole host of horrors. And she sees that people aren't black and white morally. The hunters are cruel and apathetic, but Joel was just like them, so can you truly classify everything as just good guy, bad guy like in those comics she reads? In the show, Ellie still kills someone to save Joel, and yeah, it's a good scene, but it doesn't have as good a payoff. No backing Joel up in a fight, she shoots a truck instead. So many good moments that further that theme. Love is primal, love is violent, that were scrapped for TV. Joel doesn't save Ellie from being taken by some random raider. That skirmish lacks that intimate bloody angriness the game bit did. I could go on and on. As much as I like all these changes of the game self-contained, I question whether or not it aided or harmed the show by switching things up and taking the focus away from Joel and Ellie. Don't get me wrong, I love getting that viewport into other characters. The Last of Us as a name refers to a lot of different things. It isn't just referencing the lead characters or humanity fighting back against a big threat. It can be with anyone or anything. Who is your us? Who or what is your thing you tie to yourself and defend no matter what? It's a broad concept that can be stretched out into smaller, compelling stories, and that is what we got more of in this show. A lot of you have probably noticed I've been dodging around the Bill and Frank episode, usually only really using it as an excuse for a fun call to action. Which you should definitely do. I have a Discord server and I worked so hard on this, so please subscribe and join there. I've agonized and suffered, and now I gotta say this is an episode I have a complicated relationship with.
Oh, fuck you!
I took one of the most standout sections from the source material and repurposed it to be a standalone love story between two people finding love and holding on to enriching each other's lives beyond just basic survival. As its own thing, it's an incredible story that will stick with me for years. It's beautiful, it's heartbreaking, and it made me cry. But when I look back on it as one very long episode of a 9-part series that already has a bit of a pacing problem with not enough episodes, should it have stayed? Bill's section in pixel form I wrote off initially as a diversion that served to get you a car, teach Joel a lesson, and introduce the bloater. And 2 out of 3 of those were accomplished in the episode, so at first I didn't mind that it was changed. But replaying that segment, there's a lot there that's lost. It really showcases the growing pains between Joel and Ellie. Ellie is fascinated by the world and wants to build a connection with Joel, pushing to get a gun or weapon so she can help him in combat, trying to initiate conversation, and all the while he's closed off and being very matter of fact when he does talk to her. And Bill serves as a mirror to a part of Joel that closed himself off from the world. The game is asking the question of, what's the point of surviving if you're not living? Bill got rid of the man he loved and is going about the motions, methodically tending into his traps and reinforcing his perimeter all to further him sitting alone in a church jerking off to gay porn. But Joel doesn't want to do that. He chooses living over surviving, he lets himself feel again, and he's also presumably not gay. Ellie and Joel needed more time in the show to flesh out their relationship. A lot of potential was lost in choosing to tell this story instead. I don't think this episode was filler or anything like that, it has a lot of crucial thematic purpose, but they had 9 episodes to tell this story in, and very little of that time is as focused on Joel and Ellie as it should, and it only adds to this world they're building not being what Marlene describes it as. With 9 episodes and this being one of them, it doesn't help paint the picture that this world is dangerous and brutal when the big threat was a few guys walking into a fence. And it's a shame too. I see all the incredible work they put into bringing someone like the Infected to life, making them as faithful and realistic as possible, but they barely appear and don't have much presence. The whole reason The Last of Us had zombies instead of just being a nondescript sickness or virus that made society break down was so that it could make the world feel more violent and cutthroat. But here the reason for their inclusion seems more ceremonial. Like, we can't do a Last of Us show if we don't bring over the cordyceps. And that's kind of true, you could still do this story without, but I and others would be mad if they didn't bring over one of the IP's most unique trademarks. But I want it to be justified for more than just an episode. They got rid of spores, why? So they didn't have to wear gas masks for an episode? They added in this new hive mind game mechanic for it only to be in one episode? Why? What the issue is comes down to interpretation, I suppose. Either it's A, the 9 episodes was not enough time to tell this story in and would have benefited from more episodes or longer runtimes. Or B, it's the shape metaphor, the Watchmen kerfuffle, where you're plopping a story meant to be told in a specific medium into unfamiliar waters. People give this game shit for popularizing the movie game, but when you break down this and everything I talked about, it's plain to see that this story was made to be told in the format of a game. And attempting to fully translate these moments and themes that were illustrated through gameplay is going to be next to impossible. No matter what, the show could never be 100% superior to the game. It does some things better, like David, Sam, Henry, and Jackson, but there remains some stuff that could be improved, or some things that are just straight up missing. Without that interactive factor, you can't match up to how the game sold you on this relationship. You can't walk around the environment and observe all these mini stories that paint a complete picture. Ish's sanctuary in the sewer, the Fireflies being a complicated, morally ambiguous faction, Raiders showing what people in the apocalypse can resort to sustain themselves. With all this said though, I do still prefer this show when it does its own thing with a grip on the same emotional center. I don't need every plot beat to be the exact same, nor do I want it to be. At its core, I don't agree with the principle most hold in regard to what makes a good adaptation. I don't like the idea you often see spun around that when adapting a story you should adhere 100% to your source material. Because then why? What's the point? Why adapt something if you're not going to make changes? All that makes for is a really boring adaptation. What writers should prioritize when making an adaptation is sticking to the core of the story, examine what made it special and maintain that. If you were to give me another choice where I can choose between the same thing I've experienced before with a new coat of paint or new stories I've never seen before based off the foundation of what I already know, I want to see something new. I want to see the new, not the old. We're in the Wyatt timeline. Fuck you, Fergus. Typoh is not Joel anymore. Joel is Pedro Pascal, and for me as someone who is familiar with the game, that disconnect is always going to be present. Which kind of has me circling back and asking the questions I began this video with. What makes this show different from other video game adaptations, and did this show even need to exist in the first place? And both of those are loaded questions, to say the least, but despite some of the issues I laid out, this show is still one I'm incredibly thankful exists. And as for what made this better than other adaptations, it isn't the cast or the crew or how accurate the set design is. It was that it took a story that had been in people's minds for the last decade and made it approachable to those who never would have experienced it otherwise. My parents watched this show, my friends watched this show, everyone knows the story of these two characters. My mum and dad, people who never would have even touched this game, now get to experience so many of the moments I did in a format that's more approachable. They were impacted by Sarah's death, they watched someone going about the motions, learn to live again, and they were left contemplating if that one selfish choice was right or not. Even with all these changes, some for the better, some for the worst, I'm appreciative that they took those chances, that they diverged whilst bearing in mind how it serves the greater story. I never wanted a one-to-one recreation, I wanted its existence to be justified. And though again there are some things that could have executed a lot stronger, I'd say it has justified its existence. Building off an already amazing foundation and being unafraid to try new things by playing to their strengths. Where before I would be dreading adaptations of some of my favourite games, now I'm excited for the possibilities of what could come from them. Things made by a new generation, who grew up with these games and are dedicated to translating them as faithfully as possible. More people are going to be swept away by Rapture's question and ideology. They're going to be moved by this story of a father and son coming to terms with guilt and regret. And they'll be able to see these worlds in a way they'd have been unable to before. And I'm looking forward to seeing what Craig Mazin and Neil Druckmann do with The Last of Us Part 2. Because that game is going to be a fucking mess. Bye bye Pedro Pascal, and mum and dad, get ready for misery, disappointment and confusion, because if they do go one-to-one with that, then all hell is going to break loose, mark my words. Oh my god, video is over, it's been so long, I feel like the whale. Not in the big fat guy sense, but in the sense I've been laying around under the weight of my own shortcomings forever and can now finally ascend into heaven and never have to think about a Last of Us ever again. Elephant in the room. Video took a long time to make, like 3 months to be exact. I was constantly rewriting and second guessing this video a lot and only actually finished writing the script like the other week. Making this video in that time I've had like 6 mini character arcs, and one of them is I can't keep doing stuff like this. No matter how you swing it, taking 3 months where I'm a ghost and return with an hour-long video on a show that finished forever ago isn't good for anyone. For me, the person making it, and you, the people watching it. This is a plant I gotta water and I'm letting the thing die for the sake of taking a massive gamble. There's a lot of good with this video, I worked extremely hard on it and I really hope you will comment, subscribe, like the video and share it around so I can get more eyes on it. But for a good minute, no more long things like this. No more going radio silent for months. I have a Discord server that I want to get more active and engage with you all in, and there's a Twitter I have in dire need of followers so I can tweet updates for future videos. And those future videos are going to be shorter things, stuff I can make more quickly and more efficiently. I want to get these wheels turning again, and editing this I got the bug to make a ton of videos that fall under that kind of model. So stay tuned for those. I want to experiment, I want to branch out, and I want to carve out a new path for this channel in the next few weeks, which I hope you will enjoy and stick around for. If you want to help justify all the time and effort I poured into this video, then do all the stuff I said. Comment your thoughts on this video or the topic, subscribe, like this video, and join my Discord server so I can get to know you all better and involve you in all the stuff I'm gonna make soon. But yeah, that's all for now. Any more words and I'll go insane. Goodbye.